we are in a series in which I am kind of walking us through research that was a part of my doctoral program that led to its conclusion in the spring of this year, but was put out for everyone to hear. So people have asked me different times, can I read your dissertation or something like that? And this school didn't actually do that. It actually had us work with the program. So the podcast is my dissertation, though that doesn't help if you're someone who's like, but I want to read. It's like, I understand. I will have an email at the end. There is one paper that I'm more than willing to share, which was kind of a foundational type of thing relative to the research that I was doing. And so what I've done at some of our sessions over this season, over this year, has kind of walked us through some of the research that became part of that podcast. And the general sense of the research has been investigating, well, to put it bluntly, what's gone wrong in the country. And that's my take. Not everybody has to agree that anything has gone wrong. But the evidence is fairly overwhelming that something has transpired. And so we've looked at three topics so far this year. So early on, we looked at the unique basics of the U.S. structure. And if you use these QR codes, they take you right to the YouTube place where my YouTube channel is, if you're interested in those. And this one was looking at the Enlightenment, how the Enlightenment played both a key role and has also led us astray, not by the Enlightenment's fault, but by misunderstandings, which is kind of one of the core things of what my research is, and we'll show you another slide in just a second. But it's this idea that part of our problem is that we have forgotten our history or have had it poorly taught, and in such, then we have ended up with bad outcomes. The third thing that we talked about most recently was from colonialism. So what lessons can we learn? And again, all three of these, and then today's lesson, which looks at the documents from 1776, is trying to examine for you and I, how do we understand, or what clues can we find? Again, my premise is something has gone wrong. Again, you don't have to agree with the premise, although I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming. And I express it like this way. These are actually like the official things I had to write for the school, so it's a lot of text, I understand that. But I express it this way in that sense of saying something's happened that is a body in motion stays in motion, right? In the laws of physics, right? So for it to change its direction or to stop its motion, something has to act upon it. And largely, not in a we're perfect or I'm kind of not in on the American exceptionalism crowd kind of thing, but if you're ranking societies through human history, the USA would be clearly in the top 10, probably in the top 5 of like successful, and you obviously have to define what success is, societies. And going into World War II, it could arguably be said we were the envy of the world. And I'm arguing that over the previous, particularly the last 60 years, that something has happened. And so we should investigate that to see what has happened. And one of the core things that this session and last session in particular we're kind of digging into was this idea here, that for this type of a system to work, one must have a moral virtue foundation. Now there's a lot here I kind of want to say. First thing I want to say here is do not hear the word moral and immediately tag it to something religious or like good. The way I like to think about it is like every human I've ever met has morals. The question is just where do their morals lie on a variety of different topics we could investigate into. That's just my perception. That may be wrong, or you don't have to agree with me on that. But it is this idea of saying, it's not that I have morals and those losers who voted for the wrong person have no morals. It's that we have different morals. And that may be normal if you think of a group like even in this room that we might have different views on things. That I think is actually kind of normal to the human experience. But what the founders argued, and they kind of took their clue from both Rome and Athens and some of the other attempts at citizen government, but most famously Rome and Athens, they argued that you can't do this system without, and the key word really is common moral virtue foundation. All right, so having lost that held in common, it becomes impossible. Which of course then raises the question for the listener, well, maybe I don't think the system that was there before is worthy of being saved and should be rejected or abandoned. You're allowed to say that. I'm just one more citizen like you, so I'm not special. But for myself, I find the system that the founders set up and that had worked for, roughly 150, 170 years with some degree of success worthy of preserving. So that's kind of my whole vibe, is that I want to be a participant in saying, well, let's see if we can save this thing. And there's a lot to it. There's a lot more pieces. I understand that, and that's kind of where the argument is being made. But then we want to try to walk our way forward to see what lessons can we be told, and then connected to that, which is one of the reasons why I'm getting to talk about it here and a couple of places where I share, is that for me, part of the hypothesis is this is connected to knowing or not knowing, or knowing incompletely, or maybe knowing poorly one's history. Now that doesn't mean I somehow am alone with this great insight of all of our U.S. history and anybody else knows nothing. It's that I'm a curious searcher like you, and I'm asking you to be a curious searcher and then go with me or on your own to pursue the evidence that's there. And the evidence is in abundance because we have a lot of our early documents and early resources, and they're available for you and me. So just on the idea that, well, why can we say that there must be a moral virtue foundation? Well, I would just offer some comments from our founders. So John Adams writing here is noting his concern that if we allow wealth and power, and then he elaborates a little bit further in the letter, ambition, avarice, and pleasure, that it will lead us into destruction. He's looking back at every other successful society, and if you look at every other successful society that has risen and, let's not use the word fallen, but declined, one of the go-to things you find in the investigation is that they became comfortable, they became, my phrase, addicted to ease, leisure, luxury, comfort. They lost their vitality and became sedentary in their comfort. And so Adams is noting this right off the bat, that if we're going to make it, we have to avoid this. Then, quoting Adams further then, you can see over here that public virtue is the only foundation of republics. So when you see the word republic, just think the phrase I like to use to keep us all on the same page is citizen governance, or government of the people, right? And we'll leave alone, some of you have been here long enough with me, you know my opinion on the R and the D word and republic and democracy, so we'll leave it alone for now, but you'll notice what they talk about here. And then Franklin in 87, the whole Constitution, which we're going to look at in September, will work great until when? Until such time as the people become corrupted, not the government becomes corrupted. And then where will that lead us? He's just noting, don't get lost in the word despotic. He's just noting that if you don't have a governance of the people, then your most likely candidate is the normative historic position of all governance when you study all peoples, all continents, all groups, from tribal to empire. It's what I call the power pyramid, where there's one or very few single people at top who have all their hands on the levers of the power. And the bulk of the people, the 95% of us, have no inclusion. We're not asked to participate. It's not you're necessarily excluded. I mean, it works out the same way. But it's just, why would I ask you? I'm in charge. And that's the normative human experience. So again, as I said before, when you look at our system and you look at the Romans, you look at the Athenians, you realize, wow, we're a bunch of weirdos. We're these oddballs of history who believe average nobodies. I mean, my people are peasant people. I mean, we come from Central Europe. We're a bunch of peasants. There's no wealth. There's no influence. There's nothing. Some of you are that way also. And you say, why would you want these bunch of nobodies to be involved in making the decision making? And there's some reasons for that, but that's the position that we took. And then Washington, in his farewell address, religion and morality are indispensable supports for what? Political prosperity, meaning the success of the entity, the success of the republic. That's kind of what he's aiming at in that process. And so for me, this is just, it's been something that's been driving me for a while. In fact, this past week, and I'll bring this up so you can kind of see the recap. This past week at my office, I found some materials that I had in 2017. 2017, I was privileged to get to go to an event that the Aspen Institute put on for professors, and there were about 15 or 20 of us sitting around a table. And we read a very thick collection of writings from the Western civilization canon, including both modern and old. So we read Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. We read the Declaration of Independence. We read the Seneca Falls Declaration by the ladies pursuing voting. We read Aristotle. We read Plato. And then we sat around the table. We talked about it with the aim being, in that little room, could we come to any conclusion or insights about good governance and the idea of a citizen structure that is for common good for all. And so we did that. And at the end, they told us, you should write down your reflections. So I found this paper that I'd written front and back. And on there, in 2017, one of my takeaways from sitting around the room with some really brilliant, lovely people who I'd gotten to know and share with, and found that we had some common views and some different views, was this statement where I said, basically, it is clear to me, without common virtues and values, we cannot sustain the government that we have. Not meaning in that time, 2017, so that was, I think President Trump had already come in his first office, but not meaning any current president, him or Mr. Obama or Mr. Biden, but the style and system. So this has been something that has been driving at me, and quite honestly, again, cards on the table, I'm someone who wants to preserve and try to save what I think is an amazing system of governance. So that's kind of the whole point, my argument through all this. So what we've been trying to working our way through is to see, well, where do we go? What's important? And one of the things that I noted in the research, and you can see it here, is that our debate is a crisis of our debate is a debate of worldview. And that shouldn't catch us necessarily off, like, I can't believe that. It's just, okay, yeah. Meaning, there's a longer story here, I can't get lost. There is a pattern that happens every 80-ish years, and we're on that pattern, right? So we hit 2020 minus 80, 1940. Oh, World War II, Great Depression. Oh, I see it. You can see it, right? You can do the math yourself. 1940 minus 80, 1860. Oh. Right? You get it when you just start looking. I think the pattern's unassailable from a sense of it being a truism. But when you look at that, and so people will say, oh yeah, we were divided over slavery. No, we were divided over worldview. We were divided over monarchy. No, we were divided over worldview. So it's always this debate over worldview. Okay, I know that might take more explanation, and you might want more than that, which we don't have time for today. But that means then, for me, that this is a spiritual question. And the reason that I emphasize that is because, to me, someone who is a watcher of society and culture over the past decade at least, if not a little longer, and arguably you go back to the 1980s with what I'm about to say, you'll go, oh yes. There have been increasingly two strident sides of the country. One saying we must become or restore that we are a Christian nation, and one saying Christianity and religion had nothing to do with this structure, and its inclusion would be ruinous. And my take on the historical evidence is that both are wrong. And so that's been my attempt to try to point this out, kind of walk through this. And then, because then that should signal for us, if we think about, well, what do you mean when you're saying a moral virtue foundation? So we'll come back to that later. Just understand that then is kind of the framework of what we're investigating. So last time, when we were talking about this a couple months ago, well, the question could be raised, well, certainly in colonization, the early colonies wanted to do one of those two things. And what we found was, no, they didn't. And we talked our way through that, and you can go watch that talk if you want to see it again. So then, to raise the framing question for us today, well, maybe if the colonists didn't, the founders did. But the founders at the founding of the country in 1776, which hopefully you all know, the semi-quincentennial. Huh? I said it. I got the word. I've been working, I've been practicing. You'd be proud of me. The semi-quincentennial is happening next year. Yeah, come on, that's a big word. I had to practice that word. I'm still having to practice it because my brain wants to make another sound in there. I'm like, no, that's not in there. Bicentennial is so easier. I won't be here for tricentennial, but those are so much easier than semi-quincentennial. In any case, semi-quin, five cents, you got it. Okay. So when they founded it, what were they trying to do? So that's what we're going to look at. But what many of you don't know, or you may only slightly know, is that in 1776, which we're going to big time celebrate next year, as you hopefully you're ready for, and you're preparing and you're thinking about, and there'll be all kinds of cool stuff. Philadelphia, the city's been working on it for like 4 years. So I don't know if City of Winter Park is, but I'm trying to get them to do it. We're going to do some stuff here at the library. But when you look at in 1776, we actually did 3 things, 2 of which we're going to talk about today. We wrote our first governance. So if someone were to say one of those 2 positions that I've taken, well, it should be in the document. It should be there for us. That's the whole point. That's what we're kind of working our way towards. All right, everybody good? All right, let's go. We're not going to do a lot of the revolution because we will next year. Trust me, next year, this whole series, both parts, is all going to be semi-quincentennial based, or almost all of it. We're going to look at some wars. We're going to talk about some women who were very important. We're going to look at the documents. We're going to actually read through the entire Declaration, like line by line, and we're going to do a bunch of cool stuff in all my sessions that we have here. So we're going to kind of jet through this. If you go to my webpage, my YouTube page, you probably can find lectures where I've done this kind of a thing. But you know this kind of a thing. So ultimately, we start off with the success at the ending of a war. By the way, that's how every great crisis cycle at the 80 years always starts. There's a successful war in which everybody should go, yeah, we're happy. And instead, immediately, they split into 2 camps and are hating each other. And so they begin to hate each other. I argue, and will not today, but go into more depth, that it's really a difference in definitions. And that becomes a key part that would have to be kind of expanded. And then we go through a series of events, some of which you were very famously, you know well what's going on there. And along the way, there's certain moments when it seemed like maybe, possibly, we'd back down, put down the chulupa and back away. You know, we're all kind of good. Franklin was working diligently in London trying to make this happen. But in the end, it's not going to happen. Mostly because men like Sam Adams weren't having it. Sam Adams could see the opportunity and he was going to go for it. And he does kind of go for it, and the Tea Act becomes a really big piece of this, kind of pushing the point of, we would say, attacking the king and attacking the idea of the monarch. So ultimately, the response of the government, which you can see again, difference of definition. So the government says we're doing X. This, by the way, should sound very familiar to you today because our government does X. And if you watch different news channels, you get vastly different responses about what that thing is. That's been true, by the way, for at least the past 25 years. At least. That's my argument, that it's not recent, it's something that's been building. They passed the coercive acts, which we're going to try to coerce Boston into being good boys and girls and following along like good citizens of the kingdom, which they were. To the 13 colonist groups, these were the intolerable acts. Well, that's what led the decision to let's draw an entire Congress from across all 13 colonies to meet in Philadelphia. So they do in 1774. See, we already missed the semi-quincentennial of that guy. We should have had that. Forgot all about it. If you go there and read, you'll see that through these meetings, a series of official documents are created. And they're all sent to the king. Notice, until we get to Tom Paine and Common Sense, they're always writing to the king. It's a very important aspect to understand. And again, the argument being made that they weren't necessarily, except for Sam Adams and his crowd, they weren't necessarily trying to rebel. They were just trying to complain about, well, the way you're doing some things is frustrating. So then what happens, obviously, is in enforcing the coercive acts, the government will send in enforcement agents. Remember, anybody who's got a badge, they're just representing the government. At this time, you don't have anybody like we call police officers. So go back to Boston and think what's happening in 3 or 4 or 5 years, and think about you as a normal citizen, like here in Winter Park or here in Orlando, and there's consistent, aggressive things happening. Cars are set on fire, roads are blocked, your person feels that you go to Publix and you're wearing the wrong shirt or the wrong hat and you get surrounded by a mob screaming at you and shouting at you, you'd call 911. You would want the government, through its agents, to come and calm the situation down and or to protect you. Well, the English government doesn't have any agents. Who does it have? It has the military. So there's a longer story as to what the military is still doing there. after the successful war. But long story short, they're brought off the frontier and brought to Boston to try to calm things down. And as we can see in our own current day in some of our own U.S. cities, the fact that they come to supposedly calm things down does not always calm things down, because some people have decided that they don't like the presence of these enforcement agents, whether they are police officers or whether they are actual military officers. And that's the human right to have that position. So that ultimately led to the clash at Lexington and Concord. And it's really, when you know what happens, you feel sorry for the British. Because if you were in charge of the British at a time when you have this kind of mob mentality happening, you would say to yourself, well, for sure, let's make sure they don't have any guns that can kill people. While they can yell and throw rocks and occasionally do a terrorist act of tar and feathering, let's not have any guns. And you can imagine what the people who were unhappy felt when word got out, they're coming to take my gun. So if you are someone who thinks our gun culture is out of control in our country today, just remind yourself, we have a long legacy of this, whatever side you're on, all right? And so it goes poorly. And the fact that it goes poorly ties into the efforts that Congress, the Continental Congress, had attempted to solve things. Let me go back real quick. They wrote a letter to the king saying, hey, king, you will need to make this right, and here's how, and blah, 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 right? And then this goes down. So they had, when they left, they had made the plan, hey, look, we'll get back together in the spring. So they do. So basically, right after this, they're going to come back. But now there's this frustration that, look what's happened. The government has shot some of our people. Again, if you're pro-government, and again, people, this should sound so familiar to us today. You would say, well, those fools were blocking the road. They decided to try to block the road in whatever city you can, I'm talking current day. You know what I'm saying? And if one of them got shot and killed, we might go, oh, I'm really sorry they got shot and killed, but don't lay down on the stupid road. For the people who are trying to make a point, they're going, that's the only way I can make my point. Can you see the clash? Right? So again, it's really a clash of definitions and expectations and understandings. So this then will then, a month and a half later, blow up in the Battle of Bunker Hill, which we're going to look at in depth next year. All you and I need to know is that tensions are spiraling out of control, and the king's not sure what to do with it, largely because he's too far away, and he has no ministers who are here to tell him, here's what's going on there, and here's how you should feel about it. And people like Ben Franklin, who were there and had a slightly better grasp, Ben does not have a great grasp of what's going on. They don't listen to him. They don't want to believe what he's saying. So this then will lead the government to make a series of steps. And these steps are understandable. They're to some degree measured, but at the same time, they are throwing a gauntlet down. And it will lead with the king making a speech saying, hey, the colonies are in open and avowed rebellion. Then the Parliament will continue to meet in October, and then they will pass what's called the Prohibitory Act. The Prohibitory Act is, for all intents and purposes, a declaration of war. It says we're going to stop and capture any ship we see flying a flag that we know is sailed from America. Now, it's not under an American flag, but we know it's sailed from America. We're going to stop and seize it. We're going to try to hit you in the pocketbook to convince you to quit being a screw-up and making all kinds of crazy decisions. Now, the Second Continental Congress began meeting in spring of '75. The first thing they did is they sent a "we're very, very sorry" note to the king called the Olive Branch Petition, and you can see the king doesn't even receive it. Now that, again, is this kind of moment where you can see the colonists themselves are not clear as to where the king's position is. And then we get to Thomas Paine's Common Sense. There's a lot of things to say. In fact, I'm pretty sure next January, the talk we're going to give is just going to be on Thomas Paine, Common Sense, and maybe some of the other things that he wrote, also at 1 in 76 and others. But Common Sense is such a huge document. But for you and me, the thing to understand is that at this moment, opinion is split. Sound familiar? Opinion is split. And the viewpoint of who's to blame. For those who were unhappy, and there were moderates in the middle who did not want rebellion, but they were unhappy. for those who are unhappy, the who was Parliament. And so they're constantly writing the king saying, hey, your ministers have done this terrible thing. We need you to fix it because we love you. We're on the same side as you. And one of the things that Paine does is in his writing, he basically says, no, the problem is both monarchy as an idea and this monarch in specific. And it was very compelling, the way he wrote, and it really swayed opinion. So starting in January of 76, if you took an opinion poll, prior to Common Sense coming out, it probably would have been like 30, 40, 30, maybe 30, 20, 50, meaning people who were loyal. The rebellion side was always in the minority. Coming out of it, it would have shifted to probably 50 or even 60% in support of rebellion. And the idea of let's kind of form our own country. So this is, again, right now, as we're talking, in 76, the group is in Philadelphia meeting. They're planning things. They've already decided we're going to have an army, so they sent George Washington off. They're trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. They're having all these conversations about what would be the most expedient thing to do, the most successful thing to do. And of course, in their midst, they're debating amongst themselves because they don't all agree. And then they begin to realize public opinion is moving ahead. Now, what's really interesting, if you do ever get a chance to read the letters of John Adams and Abigail Adams, you begin to see John, who started off as a moderate, or even he's a more conservative moderate, close to a loyalist, which is fine to be loyal. And then by the time you get to spring of 76, he is probably the most ardent revolutionary. He doesn't want the blow up like his cousin Sam does, but he definitely is thinking in terms of, we need to do this. And so there's letters between him and Abigail where Abigail's chiding him for, why aren't you guys doing something? Why haven't you guys got this passed? Why is Congress so slow? Sound familiar? And he writes back going, I'm trying. You won't believe who's here. And then he writes a whole bunch of stuff about some of the people who are here and some of the ones who are opposed. But he notes in some of his letters, public opinion is moving, and that's going to have a benefit for us in the process. Then in February, the Prohibitory Act gets to Philadelphia. So they pass in October. That shows you again how long it takes for news to come. And for the king, for the people there in Philadelphia, they're like, oh, well, this sounds like you just declared war on us. And so that leads John in May to put forth a resolution that suggested and urged each of the 13 colonies to assume, as he says there, the powers of government. Now, this is a massive move, and in John's mind, it'll pass 5 days later unanimously. In John's mind, this is the declaration of our rebellion, the declaration of our independence. I think technically it was, but as we know, it gets superseded by events that go on. And you know when he talks about the late act of Parliament. So what he's saying is they declared war on us. Like, we didn't do it. They're the ones that did it. That's kind of John's argument that he's making in the process. And you can see how he feels about it when he writes back to Abigail, when he's like, look, this is amazing. This is independence itself, the most important resolution that was ever taken in America. And then, of course, in typical John Adams to his wife's style, where the hyperbole gets going, you know, he kind of gets very emotional in his thing here as he's talking. And he has, I feel an awe upon my mind, which is not easily described. He's very emotional. He's always claims to be somebody who deeply, deeply loves the country, and he's eager to see the country move in this direction. So he's very excited. So word goes out to all the colonies. We tell you that we think you need to declare your own independence by basically writing your own constitution. Remember, these are 13 colonies, and over the, depending on which one we're talking about, 100 to 200 years of life, have their own colonial charter, which is basically a set of rules and builds the relationship between them and the monarchy, in the home country, right? So they're saying, just throw that in the trash, and we need to write a new set of constitutional documents. In fact, John at this point will be tasked by some friends in the Carolinas to go, you've got a lot of really good ideas about constitutions. You should write those down. So he does, and this becomes a key part of what they're going to start doing in the process. Now, what John will tell you that he's doing at the same time is consistently trying to work to broaden the revolution, right? Because there was some in Philadelphia when you walk in, even at the First Continental Congress, their view was, We have this problem because you guys in Massachusetts have screwed up. You guys have gone crazy. You're the reason we're in this situation. So John and others' mindset was, we will never win if it's just Massachusetts or New England against England. We're going to have everybody involved. And there were numerous Virginians who were already enthusiastic. So this is why in the spring of 75, when they come back, one of the things John does is he nominates George Washington to be the commander-in-chief of the Army. Remember, the Army is before the Declaration. So the Army's first before the country. Just keep that in mind in case you have some negative views about our military. And John Hancock from Massachusetts and Boston assumed he would be put in charge. And John nominates George Washington. It's kind of an easy slam dunk. Washington gets it. He takes off to go to Boston. And Hancock was frustrated, but the reason why is he wants to broaden the idea of the revolution. So John is, if you've ever been in settings where there's kind of open, caucusing and conversations that go on behind the scenes, John was constantly talking to people and meeting new friends from Georgia all the way up to New England so he could try to get them on board with his position. And one of his best contacts was this man here, Richard Henry Lee, who, yes, that will be his relative later who fights in the Civil War. Richard Henry Lee, to some degree with John's encouragement, will then in June put forth the resolution that leads us to the Declaration. So you see a lot of the similar language between what John had put forth in May, which was told to the 13 colonies, and then in essence what this one is saying to itself. Hey, we should declare collectively that we are going to do this rebellion. So we're going to make this happen, and that we're going to be absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them, notice the plural though, and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. So now they're taking another step to kind of do a collective thing, because they don't know how the 13 colonies are going to go. And then if you do examine the war, one of the things you'll find out as there are various places like Georgia, like South Carolina for sure, Delaware, New York itself, where the loyalist percentage was 70, 60, maybe close to 75%. So if you're counting on those states to declare themselves independent, that's not going to happen. Again, if it's government of the people, they're going to go vote. The rebels will lose and lose big. So the thought was, we probably should do a collective thing. So this is put forward in the process. And this is leading John to finally tell Abigail, we're getting there. We're going to make it. And he writes to her and he says, as you can see, look, objectives of the most stupendous magnitude, measures in which the lives and liberties of millions born, and he talks about you and me, unborn, are the most essentially interested, are before us. We are in the very midst of a revolution, the most complete and unexpected and remarkable of any in the history of nations. Again, maybe a little hyperbole, but he's kind of putting his stake down that I think this is a big deal. It's a really big deal. This is going to happen. Now remember, in the room, there's, again, at least a solid third of the representatives who are loyal. Now some actually leave. They're just like, I can't put up with this anymore. So they leave. But even if you think in terms of who's enthusiastic, like a John and a Sam Adams and John Hancock and George Washington who's left, Richard Henry Lee, there's a whole bunch of others who are like, I'm not happy with things that have happened, but in no way, shape, form, or fashion am I going to stand here and support a revolution. So that's the room. You can't ever approach the Declaration in assuming that, as we've often maybe been told, particularly as little kids, that one day we just all woke up and realized England's a terrible parent and we need to just do our own thing, and everybody thought that was amazing and we did it, and then English, ugly British tyrants came back and tried to stop us with guns. That's not the story in the process. So it's interesting, and some of you who've been here before, you know I am a massive fan of John Adams and find him both overwhelmingly misunderstood through history for a reason that we don't have time to get into, but also quite present in so many moments. And so this is one of those. In that same letter of June 9th, he lays out, here's what's going to have to happen. And what he lays out basically is a roadmap of the next 25 years of the events and activities that will be engaged upon and worked through and fought over through the whole, through where we're going to go. And most initially, you can see what happens with the resolution. So the resolution is put forward, and 2 days later, they're going to support it, but they realize, I think we need to get it more in writing than just what Lee wrote. So in a typical move by Congress and committing groups of people who sometimes are afraid to take that last step in, they go, let's table it for now, and let's put some committees to work. So they create 3 committees. One you famously know, I'm sure, but the other 2 you may not know. And so they divided up the work into these 3 committees. One, to write the Declaration, which we're going to now turn our attention focus to. But one, to write the working governing rules, so our first Constitution. And then one, to set out the rules for what will be our diplomatic strategy and how we pull it off in what they call the model treaty. How do we want the other nations of the world to interface with us? So they give them basically the month, not a full month, about 3 weeks, to kind of get it together and get working on it. So this takes us to the Declaration. The committee can be thought of, the way I like to say it, is like a school committee if you were in an upper level class where you've got all manner of students in there, and you got a couple of seniors who are put on the team. That's Adams and Franklin. You got a couple of sophomores, juniors who are put on there. That's the 2 R guys that nobody ever talks about because they didn't do anything. And you got a freshman. That's Jefferson. If you've ever been involved in any kind of school project, you know there's all these rules. A professor like me has told you to do this, 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 and a bunch of legwork. So the seniors turn to the freshmen and like, go do that. Come back the week before it's due. Let's see what you got. And they keep up with them because the seniors want to get a good grade, but they don't want to waste their time doing the legwork because they know they're about to fix it anyway, and because it's a freshman, so it's going to probably be terrible. So they turn to Jefferson. There's a lot of discussion. Modern historians go back and forth as to why did Jefferson write it. Franklin famously said, well, I'm never going to be a draftsman for anything that could be possibly, looked at by a committee or by a group of people in the public. John's claim was, well, I'm obnoxious and people hate me because I now have been somebody who talks way too much, and he was pretty much on his feet nearly every day in the various meetings. And you, Jefferson, you haven't said 5 words since you've been here, so nobody knows you, but you're handsome and you're young and you're from Virginia, so that's kind of cool. Why don't you do it? At the very least, I think we can say Adams was very aware that having a Virginian write the draft is very important. Because again, spreads out the idea. Jefferson in his own memoirs was kind of like, yeah, we just decided I would do it, which is sort of deflective of the way he likes to say things in the process. So he goes away to his court. Now, it's interesting also, Jefferson didn't want to be there. Now, one reason he didn't talk a lot is because he was notoriously shy and a reticent person from a sense of, he'd love to talk to you one-on-one with 3 or 4 people around the table, but the large-scale conversation, he wouldn't like to do what I'm doing right now. John Adams would love to do, so would Franklin. They would love it, kind of a thing. So he really wanted to go home to Virginia because, obviously, they're right near Virginia. They're only a couple of, maybe a week's ride away. And Virginia was one of the places that leapt immediately into the fray of let's write a new state constitution. And Jefferson wanted his hands on it, which is understandable. In fact, while he's writing the draft, he takes time to write 2 or 3 versions of his thoughts on government and sends it to Virginia. And like, hey, this is what we should do. But he gets stuck there and he can't leave. He often wrote about being in Philadelphia as being in this foreign land, which is how most of the people felt at that time. Their native soil was their home country. Everything else, even the next, well, you and I would say the next state over, was foreign soil. So he writes this thing. He's alone. He draws on his own incredible intelligence, as well as a variety of written things, including some stuff that had already come out of Virginia, relative to ideas about rights, and he incorporates and puts it all together, and then he gives it to Franklin and Adams and says, we need you guys to edit this. So they do, and they begin the process. It's what they write is a legal brief. We all get caught by what Adams called the high tone and flights of oratory, because the preamble, which I'm going to show you in a second, is so amazing, because it is amazing. And again, some of you know me, I'm not a fan of Jefferson. But it's an amazing document, what he wrote, and most of what we read is his. I still resist calling him the author. It's better to call him the draftsman. But perhaps that's just me being petty. Because most of it is his, which we'll talk about the edits in a moment. Adams and Franklin will contribute some editing to the process, but it's written as a legal brief. So once you get past the preamble part, the bulk of the document is a system of like lawyerly complaints about the government, and in particular about the king. And so he kind of lays those out. And at different points, Adams and Jefferson are like, that's a little far there. So for instance, this is one of my favorite ones. Jefferson had written that the king's planning to deluge us in blood. And Franklin's like, that's a little strong. So he said, didn't go too far back, invade and destroy us. Right? And just Adams said, hey, it's too passionate. And like calling the king a tyrant, that's probably over the line. When you look at the prose, though, the prose is what grabs us, right? So this is the very familiar part. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature is a key phrase, and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And there it is. This is going to be a legal brief to go to who? To a candid world. The Declaration of Independence was never written to England. It wasn't written to the king. It wasn't written to Great Britain. It was written to the world. So their viewpoint is we need to get the world on our side because, as he goes on and explains, you shouldn't just be having rebellions. Which is interesting for Jefferson, because later he'll write in his life, a little rebellion is good for a civic government. You should have a little rebellion, and people should die in it because blood is kind of the fertilizer of liberty. So you're like, okay, all right, Tom, I see kind of where you're going there. All right, feel free. But he's basically saying we want to try to explain why we think this is necessary. And with this opening statement here, in particular this idea here, that there is a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them. So when you look at the Declaration, you can already see with Jefferson, he's trying to walk a tightrope between the ideas that are present in our society at that time, which we talked about in February, the Enlightenment, and Christianity. Religion, but at this point, it's Christianity. And so he's thinking, how do I walk this tightrope? And we want to try to blend it. Most societies would have said, we're going to be connected to our specific religious god or gods. There weren't any societies that said we will have no connection with religious faith or gods. And Jefferson, obviously, as someone who we typically use the term deist or somebody who's a little distant from God, although that deserves a lot more examination to him personally as to what his personal views might have been, he obviously could have said nothing about nature's God, because he knows he's talking about the Christian God when he says that. It's not necessary the way he wrote it, and the capitalization is his, kind of a thing. And then they keep going. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We talked about this before in January when we looked at the uniqueness. These are not self-evident. If you'd have gone around the globe at that point and said, hey, do you think life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is something that you're due? And you asked every average person, they would have said, I have no idea what you're talking about. It wasn't something that they understood. It was known in Britain. So they're not self-evident. We're going to spend 249 years trying to make it self-evident to others, and now most of the globe kind of copies us. It's a whole different conversation. And we have our just powers from the consent of the governed. This is a crucial phase here, which we'll come back to in a second. And this is where he says, basically, be careful, don't just do rebellions. However, when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. Here's one of the edits of Franklin, because he had written absolute tyranny, and Franklin's like, nope, let's use despotism. Let facts be submitted to a candid world. And the facts were these series of complaints. Now, if you examine each of these, and you know British history, and you know British civic governance, their style of governance, almost all of them fall apart. Meaning in a court of law, Jefferson would have lost. The only two that really bear scrutiny is 17. When I say bear scrutiny, they only bear up. They only look like, yeah, you're right. That's he did that. He legitimately did that, and that is going too far, going beyond the bounds of what his power as king in Parliament should have been. And they imposed taxes basically without asking the local governance, and that seems to be something that British government they should have done. They did not do. And then here, 22, they suspended the local legislative bodies. That also is something that the king did not have power to do. Although in all these cases, every place he says the king, it is Parliament who's doing these things. If you study King George III, maybe we should do a subject on him sometime. Maybe next year, but I don't know, we'll see. If you study King George III alone, you realize that a way to understand him is that he's really the best model of the governance system of a parliament in which the king is in Parliament, but Parliament takes the fore. Parliament is in the lead. They're the ones kind of moving first. So it's that idea when they're blaming him, he's kind of in a corner going, I didn't do it. It wasn't me. Yes, I approve these things because that's the limit of my powers. But what they did, I didn't think was all that wrong. In any case, it worked because at the end, this is the image we have. The king as the enemy, the king as tyrant, the king as imposing himself in some way. I mean, it's the mythology that we tell ourselves. Trust me, next year, I'd like to believe I'll be wrong, but next year, whether you're watching PBS or ABC or Fox or you're watching some story about the Declaration, I won't be surprised when you're told a story about British tyranny or British overreach. And if you come here, I will show you what the evidence actually says about what went on. That's not our purpose now. Now, they finish it in time for July 1st reading, which we're going to get to in a second. But at the time they're writing it, the British are actually sending a fleet with a full army. The army that guys like Gage and Howe had asked for years before and didn't get. There's a whole other story here, and again, next year my hope is we'll do one of our whole sessions just on what happens in New York and the New York campaign and kind of how that kind of plays a critical role in 1776. But nonetheless, what you and I need to know is all of a sudden a massive army, and for us with World War I, World War II in our heads, we think these are small numbers. This is the largest army that the British Empire or the British government had sent out to this point in their time. So 15,000 troops. It was a massive army. And they land in Staten Island and Long Island, and they're greeted with love and support. Again, George Washington's already there with his army, but nonetheless, the overwhelming percentage of population in New York was loyal. Which again, remind yourself then, it's not like 100% of the country wanted to rebel and had to fight against the tyrant. Really, and I think I've already said it on the slide, but if you dig into it, the American Revolution was really a civil war. That's the right way to say it. I've been trying to say this for 20 years. When you know it's a civil war, it then puts into context the thing we're going through now. It also, I think, for me, helps lessen the overemphasis that we put. We've had one civil war. We've had one we call civil war. But we've actually had 4 civil wars, or arguably 5 if you go back to the 1600s. And when you know that, a war between the civil society, war being a strong word, but a struggle, a fight, a difference of opinion. I know this is controversial, don't hate me for it. We're in a civil war right now. It's a cold civil war, like the Cold War after World War II, but we're in a civil war right now, and we're struggling our way through it. That's a whole different conversation, but I still think I can support that. So then, July 1st, what happens? They read it, there's quiet in the room, and the opposition goes first. John Dickinson is principally the opposition. He's the one who's first going up to say, I want to try to explain this. And he comes after it. And he spends about an hour saying how this is a terrible idea. And he said it's like making a boat, a skiff, out of paper and trying to sail. This is a disaster, particularly if you're going to sail such a boat out into a storm. It won't work. This is a disaster. We have no right for doing this. When he finished, the word is he sat down and there was silence in the room. A thunderstorm was beginning to kick up outside Philadelphia, adding to the ambiance. And everybody was looking to John. Because if anybody was going to answer him, it had to be John. Now the rest of them will talk, but John goes first. And he gets up to make roughly an hour and a half speech. in defense, kind of works his way like a lawyer. Remember, Adams was a lawyer, working his way through everything that he believed had happened, that he thought the evidence supported, working his way to. Now, the interesting part is about halfway through, some guys came in who didn't hear the first part, and they demanded that he tell them a summary, and he couldn't, and he just basically did the whole thing again. So he basically stood and spoke for 2.5 to 3 hours. I tell my students our 50-minute class is not, an hour and 15 minutes. But in any case, this is the moment where for many, as you can see here, many of the representatives in the room, it was just clear that John Adams was the leading figure in kind of walking us through the whole process of debate. When they finished, they voted. And 9 states voted in favor, but 3 states voted against. 1 state abstained. It had passed. Yay! But they weren't happy. They're like, I don't know. So they decided to abstain. Again, there was more debate besides Dickinson and Adams. They had about 9 hours of conversation in the process. This is when they get word that the fleet has arrived. And they're like, oh, shoot, it's on now. It's for real now. And, for some, Philadelphia had voted against it. Pennsylvania, which is so odd because, they're hosting this thing. And Ben Franklin. But Dickinson was from Pennsylvania. So Dickinson was the leader of the opposition. And so they had voted 4-3 against because every state got 1 vote. So that's kind of how they did things. Every state got 1 vote to kind of work their way through. That night, some kind of a conversation happened with Dickinson. It's not very clear. The evidence is not as clear as we would want it to be. He probably wasn't threatened, but Dickinson could read the room, and he understood where we were going to go, and he knew it was in the benefit of all of us to have a unanimous vote. So he decided, along with one of his closest friends, to stay home the next day. So that flipped the vote for Pennsylvania from 4-3 against to 3-2 in favor, with Franklin obviously leading the charge. And when Philadelphia, Pennsylvania flips its vote, South Carolina, which also had voted against, flips its vote to support. Delaware was the last no vote. It was really a no vote by abstention because they had 1 yes and 1 no. Now, New York technically did abstain. They said, we're not voting. We believe in you, but we have no word from Albany on what to do. But you and I know why, because the Army's there, because it's mostly loyalist. So they would have voted no if they had actual working orders from Albany. So they're doing the best they can by just abstaining. But for Delaware, they are missing a partner. He shows up overnight. Caesar Rodney, if you want a little factoid to kind of throw out there, he shows up overnight and makes the vote for Delaware, 2 in favor, 1 against. And so they vote. So the final vote then, as you go down, is for the change. So 12 vote in favor, 12-0-1. Then they go into committee of the whole. We don't have the actual numbers. There's somewhere about 45 to 49 men in the room. They make over 80 edits. Jefferson hated all of them. Adams defended everything the committee had done, but still over 80 edits are made in the room. And this is another one of those moments where clearly if they wanted to be more strong in their kind of Christian verbiage, they could have. They did not. They did not go down that road. If you say, well, was there anything about faith? And one of these I've already kind of mentioned to you. Yes, there was. Obviously, there's the whole part there about nature's God. Jefferson clearly could have written something else. And in fact, one of the edits Franklin makes is here. Jefferson wrote, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. Well, Jefferson's not a guy you typically use the word sacred with. It's not something that you think's in his vocabulary or in his worldview. So whether he was doing it because it's how he felt or if he was doing it as a nod, again, to try to walk this tightrope, he still does it. Again, Franklin makes the change to what we're more familiar with and probably is a much better reading of it that we've already talked about. And then we come back to this thing I already told you about, this idea of consent of the governed. There's a longer story here than I have time for, but just understand that when you go back to 1776 or before, I'd suggest even after, and you go to these other nations or states and you say, why don't you let people vote? At the root of it would have been a position of like, kind of, why would we? They have no value. And here the Americans were basically taking from a Christian position of every human having value. Now, you and I, or at least I, would quickly rush to look then to all 13 colonies and go, well then why do you have slavery? And that's a fair question to kind of nail them on. And remember, it's all 13 colonies have slaves at this moment, all of them. So why? Why do you do that? By the way, that then points out when somebody like John Adams doesn't have slavery, it's not like, well, he was in Massachusetts, of course not. No, there are slaves in Massachusetts. He chose not to. So when you see the people who were anti-slavery, it's valuable. So there's a deeper conversation at that point for us to criticize, for Carl to criticize the founders in thinking, well, how could you say they have value? But I'll still stick to my guns here that why would they believe in the consent of the governed if they didn't believe every person has a value inherent in them? By the way, you and I could also criticize them for saying, well, then that should include the women. And you don't include the women. Again, a valuable complaint and critique, which, trust me, next year we'll dig deeper in on. You don't have to buy me on this one, but I think it's a key aspect when you look at the contribution Christianity brings to Western society that is unique to the world and in the West. It is this idea. And so they're kind of leaning on that with this concept of the consent of the governed. And then, of course, there's the laws of nature and nature's God. And so, again, my position is they're blending the Enlightenment with the majority view. It's not correct, and I don't say in the podcast or anywhere else, to say that the United States was ever a Christian nation. It is correct to say that it was a nation peopled mostly with Christians at this point. By the way, just to pause for a second, when I go back and I talk to you about a moral virtue foundation, I am not suggesting we should all become Christians, or we should only take our ideas of these moralities or these virtues from Christianity. That's a whole different conversation, but I just want you to understand, all I'm trying to say is what were they doing when they were thinking we need to have this foundation? What did they draw on? And then you and I can decide in 2025 to do whatever we want to do as the citizens who are alive here now. They're not alive now, so they don't get to tell us what to do. But for you and me wanting to learn our lesson from what they did, it's to me useful to say, well, just what did they do? So they're leaning in on this in the process. And then there's one last couple of pieces to look at here before we shift gears. And that is to say that the committee does go ahead and put an even stronger stance to this idea of bringing Christianity or religion into it by these two changes that you can see if you read the closing. So after the preamble, there's the legal brief, then there's a couple of paragraphs. Basically, the committee had a very short kind of the end kind of statement. And the men in Philadelphia are like, no, that's not good enough. And they wanted to add more. You can see the things that they add. You can read it for yourself, obviously. So they appealed to the supreme judge of the world. That kind of phrasing was used multiple times. And they believed in this protection of divine providence. So again, it's sort of both the Enlightenment view that, yeah, maybe there is a God and that being has set things in motion, but then backed out, and at the same time a Christian view of God active in the world, immanent, coming by, being with his people, quote unquote, that they're trying to blend. It's a very unique formulation in the story. It all passes all through these dates. You can see moments when things happen, including Washington reading in New York. Adams, who first would have told you May is the better date for a revolutionary celebration, said, well, probably July 2nd. He obviously is wrong, because what goes down in our minds is that final reading on the 4th, although the fireworks don't really happen till the 8th. So, you could just pick a date in July and celebrate and throw fireworks up. If your neighbors don't like it, just go, hey, that's when they did it back in 76. And kind of go from there. Okay, let's go past this. Now, the second committee, because we have to spend time here kind of digging in to say, well, what's happening here? Because somebody could argue, well, whichever side you wanted, they did those things in the Declaration, but those weren't the working constitutional rules. Maybe in the constitutional rules, they take one of the two sides that I offer people in modern society are arguing from, at least a large percentage of our country. So our boy Dickinson is in charge. This is one of the funniest things to me. I love this fact. Like, who's the leading voice against the rebellion? John Dickinson. Who gets to who chairs the committee to write the first Constitution? John Dickinson. I just find that hilarious. It demonstrates Dickinson's kind of view of his moderation. Actually, Dickinson will leave here in the fall, before the final thing is all done, and go and march with a regiment of patriot militia to fight in Washington's army. So he will participate on the battlefield. So he doesn't go join the British. He doesn't, pull out the loyalist flag and wave it high and go join, that side of things. He's with the country. So it's really important, I think, to see his hand on this, although that's not to suggest what we have as our first government is only a Dickinsonian type thing, because really he works off of material from Franklin. So Franklin in 75, and long before 75, actually back to 1754, he had already been trying to think of, well, what could governance look like? How would you do governance? And so, for instance, Franklin was a big fan of a unicameral system. So that's one house and a legislative body. That's what we'll end up here, one house and a legislative body. So they're kind of borrowing from Franklin. This document will be the first time the phrase United States of America is used, but in a very telling thing for you and me, it's a plural noun. You do know today we all use it as single noun. The United States is in the Olympics. The United States is going to a meeting in NATO. We use it as a single noun. Up to the Civil War, it was always a plural noun. The shift happens after the Civil War in the late 19th century. Right? So there is some who didn't like it here. We'll talk about that in a second, as what they do. So they do actually debate this document right after basically the 9th and 10th and latter part of July and into August. They say, okay, let's do it. The committee produces its draft, says, here's the working government. So Franklin, Benjamin Rush, Jefferson, Adams, they're all in the room while this is being debated as to what they should do and how should the governing rules work. One of their biggest arguments will be one, if you know your constitutional history story, will be familiar. Do we want equal representation or proportional representation connected to population? And, not surprisingly, the large states want it to be proportional because it gets them more votes, and the small states want it to be equal because they're afraid they'll be overwhelmed. What's interesting about this, though, for you and me, is the fact that Adams, Rush, and actually Franklin, I should put Franklin's name on that list, they saw the idea of proportional representation as a way to begin the blending and building of a national identity. In other words, they believed that you and I could look at Congress and not only think, what's my representative doing, the dude from Florida, but what is happening for all the representatives because they all collectively represent me. Now, that's not how we do it, and that's not how we think about it, but that is definitely kind of where they're thinking. Well, it's also interesting at this point, at least I find it interesting, is that as I told you, Adams had already written his thoughts on governance, which became one of the dominant documents in building constitutional thought. And in it, and Adams will do this multiple places, including the Massachusetts Constitution, he believed in a bicameral legislation. But in none of our records does he speak up saying that here. So it's interesting to me that he doesn't say that, or we don't have a record of him saying that. You can see that we're going to begin having the same battle that will lead us to the very tragic and terrible 3/5 compromise emerging at this point. And you can see the same threat of disunion already being broached by some of the places, including our good friends in South Carolina. That if, hey, you're going to start counting slaves and including slaves and trying to do anything about slavery, we're out. And so the concern for unity that had led them to not accept a 9-3-1 vote when we need to everybody on the same page makes them go, okay, well, then we won't talk about it. We'll just kind of leave it aside. In the debate, if you get a chance to ever read it, there's a real fascinating exchange between Ben Franklin, who really at this point, which shows a shift in his own personal views. Ben Franklin of the 1750s would not have been an abolitionist. But Ben Franklin of 1776 and later becomes one of the most ardent abolitionists that we have in the early phase of kind of the abolition movement that existed first in the United States. I know all you fans of William Wilberforce are going, wait a minute, we can talk about that later. Actually, we may talk about it next month, actually. So, they can't finish their work because Washington's getting his little butt kicked in New York. And we're losing. And he's being chased all through, first up Manhattan and then all the way down the rest of New Jersey and then into Pennsylvania. And then he basically saves himself by getting across the Delaware late in the season. General Howe is offering an amnesty bill that is being widely accepted by people all through the middle colonies. And by large measure, you could think, well, actually the revolution may not matter because we may just lose in the whole process. So there's more to that story. But in the process, this meant the guys in Philadelphia had to get out. They had to run for their lives. So they flee. So there's a lot of things going on. As I told you, Dickinson will go to the military. If you know John Adams' story and Franklin's story, they'll be sent on diplomatic missions. So they'll start leaving, and there'll be a lot of like who's in the room and who's really the Congress and who's really talking their way through it. They'll finish the draft, though, a decent enough draft in 77. But you can see as they're working, kind of a tone is taking place, which I don't think is an aberration, but certainly losing men like Franklin and Adams in the room helped to build this tone. And that was what we were building was as they call it, a confederation of equal sovereign states. And I hasten to add, I think it's on another slide coming up here, when you hear the word state, you and I think of small, discrete piece of a larger whole. Okay, yeah, there's the state of Florida, there's the state of Texas, there's the state of Ohio, right, but they're just pieces of a whole. That is not the historic view of the word state. The historic view of the word state is to make it equivalent to nation, or equivalent to kingdom, or equivalent to empire. All these words, tribe, empire, all these words that we think of to describe a civic governance are in one sense synonyms of each other. I know there's differences, but there's synonyms nonetheless. So what you need to hear them saying when they're saying state first or state control, or here, there's this idea of any efforts that the initial draft had to give the central government more power were dropped. They were just dropped or minimized. They got hundreds of amendments from different places as they started hearing about the draft. Almost all the amendments were to take even more power from the central government. In essence, if you'd ask most Americans, what do you want? Besides saying to be left alone, they would have said, I want my state to thrive in a very loose relationship with the other states. And if your brain immediately goes to Europe, yes, that's what they were trying to build. The idea of a union, kind of hang out, but we might go to war with each other if we have to, but we don't have to agree with each other, and we'll do what we want to do here in Poland, and you do what you want to do in Hungary, and leave us alone. That kind of an idea, which potentially could work. It's worked in Europe. But for men like John Adams and Franklin and George Washington, as we'll see as we go forward, that's going to put us greatly at risk for lots of different reasons. So they're going to be opposed to it. So in the end, what they come up with is this basically, like I said, a confederation, a firm league of friendship for the common defense, the security of liberties, and mutual and general welfare. And again, the power lay with the states being sovereign and independent. That's in the document. Sovereign and independent. So again, you think how you want to think about it, about what the U.S. Civil War 61 to 65 is about. But when you have people arguing today, even looking back, but certainly then, about states' rights, they're not making that up. They're not pulling that out of thin air. No matter how you and I may feel about the issue of slavery and its centrality to that struggle, you can't deny they're coming from it on a position of going, dude, we built the country this way. Which is why this annoys a lot of people. Warn you ahead of time. You can hear somebody from like Alabama going, look, you don't like slavery? Don't move to Alabama. I ain't bringing my slaves to Ohio. You just stay up there. And then we go, most of us, well, how can we have a common union if we have that deep disparity? And then your little brain should go, oh, that's what Carl's talking about. Because you have to have a common value system. And at that point, 1860, it was clear we didn't. So we're going to have to fight about it. And it turns out to be bloody, but nonetheless. What else did they do? That you couldn't impose restrictions on states. There's no executive, no judiciary, and there's no ability to levy taxes or regulate commerce. Why? Well, because we're fighting a war against the executive. I mean, come on. I mean, that's pretty clear. I'm just going to go back to this. The judiciary, well, that's in every state. And then taxes and regulate, we're fighting a war about taxes. So if anybody's going to raise taxes in South Carolina's government will. Otherwise, leave us alone. And so then that became this kind of way of they were thinking about things. And really, you could argue to say the only thing holding them together was the war and the personage of George Washington. So the war giving us a common enemy. And if you ask George Washington, he would tell you the largest struggle he had was not against the British, but against the unwillingness of Americans to participate in the struggle. In other words, hey, we're down here in Georgia, we got no problems, leave us alone. I don't want to have to pay money or send you my food or my donkey to fight some battles up in Philadelphia. And so George consistently wrote, which is why he becomes such an ardent nationalist of viewpoint in the process. It was going to be a legislative-led government. Again, we're fighting a war against the king. It's unicameral because of basically, the idea that that Franklin had built in the process. There was this acknowledgement as far as judicial goes that if a state was told that there's basically somebody fleeing from justice, you have to deliver them to the other state. But there's no need for a national judiciary. Why would I, living in Virginia, want to have somebody rule about my life from New Hampshire? Had been their thought process. Every state had one vote. There's no voting for the representatives. There was left to the state legislatures. This will be the same thing we do with the Senate, those of you know our Constitution. And if you've been here when I've talked about it, which we will in September a little bit, I still argue that's a brilliant move because what it does is it brings the election closer. It doesn't feel like it on first glance. The senator is just going to do whatever he, and we would say she, wants to do. But if I have a greater representation through my Florida representative, then they have a smaller number of constituents when they're sitting in Tallahassee, and quite honestly, I can more easily threaten them to unseat them in the next election if you don't do what I want. And one of my complaints may be our senator is doing crazy stuff. Go get them. In any case, there was no elections and there was no numbering of the group. This becomes a real problem for them as they're kind of working their way through because it's not clear if they're going to be able to have a quorum. It's not like today where you're elected to be the representative and you kind of understand in that process that you're from a certain area. It's just, they just randomly said, you, and you go up there to where they are. And they didn't even have a location. That's also part of the problem. The war's going on, that's going to slow up ratification in the process, but they're struggling to kind of get their footing. And then this is one of the ones that's also, by the way, if you think, again, we're a democracy, I'm telling you we're not. And this is one of the ways you know this, because they wanted everything to be not by majority rules, which is what should happen in a democracy. And so it's ratified slowly. So again, first in 77 is when they finish, 4 years later in 81. Mostly that's because of the war. Some of that was because of concerns about who controlled the land. I'm going to show you a map here in a second. But the western lands, all the colonies' position was their charter had given them, in essence, control of the land from sea to shining sea. They just don't know where the other shining sea is. And they don't know how far it is. But in their minds, it's that direction. And for Virginia, they basically thought all of the north should basically be, United States of Virginia. So that's their posture based on where the Potomac goes and how the angle of it goes kind of cuts off for them. So there's debates because obviously New York and Connecticut and Massachusetts and others were like, wait, we've claimed that land also. So that becomes an issue. But eventually Maryland gives in and it's ratified on March the 1st. And what about the whole religious question that we've kind of been raising and talking here? We're going to, I think, finish right about here. If you have any questions you want to ask. It's not mentioned. And most of that is because of that state first focus. So you are already getting these different state constitutions, some of which are declaring a connection, usually to Christianity. They demand a test oath by anybody elected to office for their states. So the Articles of Confederation people thought, well, we don't have to do that because they've already done that. But then just like the Declaration, they kind of have this closing sentence where they're kind of tossing out their acknowledgement and their recognition of, again, it's a nation peopled mostly with Christians, the recognition of we're going to get our virtue, moral position from this faith in the story. So I know we have a little bit more time, but I'm trying to think if I want to walk us through this or save this. I think what I want to do is tell you about their... So there's a struggle to make it work. This really, I need this lecture to start in another hour for the next lecture to make it make sense, because these blend over here. Like what they did with the Articles is partially why we have a Constitution, the second Constitution, which unfortunately for you and me is called the Constitution. They didn't give it a cute name. A set of laws is a constitution, small c, but they had a capital C, proper noun, the Constitution. So many people think we've only had one constitution. We've had two. And from people's point of view, like John Adams, George Washington, and then some younger leaders like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, this thing becomes a nightmare. It doesn't work at the national level. But you have to remind yourself at the state level, they're like, this thing's great. This thing's working perfectly. And that then becomes the deciding, is its success measured by how you feel in your state, which most people thought it's going okay, or is it measured by how it's doing at the national level, in which anybody looking at the national level would say it's not working very well. It's just unwieldy. No differently than if you look at the EU today, as they're scrambling and struggling with worries about Russia and economics and different people elected. If you know your European story in the current days, with some people elected who have very divergent views about human rights or rules and these kinds of things for their individual state. And there's a lot of European leaders who are wringing their hands trying to figure out what to do because they're not unified as a single entity, which is fair. That's their choice to do what they want to do. So that's where that debate lies between, say, a pro-nationalist view of a United States and a collective view of these United States, and kind of working their way through. Let me show you a couple of things that they did. One is, I already told you this part, but I think it's hilarious, that they can't ever get a quorum. If you know your kind of Robert's Rules of Order, you basically say, we won't make any decisions unless we have like a quorum of enough people, and they declared it needed to be 9 of the states represented. I don't think there's an actual counting of the times, but if Madison's to be believed, easily half the time they would meet and then they would just adjourn because there wasn't a quorum. And then they could never get anything done if the state only sent 2, because every state got 1 vote. So you had to run the risk of the 2 opposing each other being the equivalent of a no vote. And they're like, can you not send more than 2 people? So they actually send a resolution asking, please send 3. And what's interesting about this story is when you look at it, all they could ever do, now some of us might wish Congress did this today, all they could ever do was make mere recommendations. So here's the verbiage from like 3 different acts, but all of them say an equivalent of this, and you can see, so this is Congress speaking about X. We need this from you, so we earnestly recommend. It's indispensably necessary. It is recommended. And they're trying to say, please, please, please. And the states are like going, la, 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 not listening, don't care, not gonna worry about it, not our problem. And so, they're having a problem. This shows up easiest in money. I've showed you this one before, I've been here before. In 81, they wanted $3 million. They sent in 39,000. Another counting, over the whole time of the Articles, 10 million requested, 1.5 was given. Now, not to bash these people, I don't know about you, but if my letter from the IRS was like, hey, you owe this much, and there's no system that they pull it out from every month, I might not pay mine either. Now, you might be a good boy or girl, and you would dutifully pay your taxes, but I'm like, hey, I don't think I've got it. I don't think I'm going to pay you. I don't think I like the governance that you're doing, so I'm not going to. And it'd be interesting to see, of course, they all take it from us on our 1s and 0s, and we don't really have much of a say-so in the process. But they did have one success. I'm going to skip some slides. You'll see them if you come in September. They did have one success, and that is they dealt with the Western lands. And the Western lands kind of give us a vision of how they could possibly work together. And through a series of acts in 1784, which was authored by Jefferson when he was a Virginia representative to the Congress. He was there 1 year before he sent off to Paris as our ambassador. And then in 1785, they made rules about the Western lands. These are all known collectively as the Northwest Territory Ordinances, right? But what's interesting is in 84 and 85, actually nothing technically happens. We talk about those because they do lay some foundation of what's going to happen with Jefferson's in 84 and then the next time in 85. But really it's just them talking like Congress likes to talk in theoretics and in vagaries, and then nothing actually is concluded in the process. Until such time as they realize, well, shoot, we actually need to make some money. And if we sold the land, we could make some money. So they began to work their way forward in doing that. And in 1787, the third of the ordinances will happen, mostly because there were abolitionists in New England who say, we want to go there and try to carve out a place where there's no slavery, that could be a place for people to come and free their slaves. It could be a place that we could begin to try to model a different society. Congress is not itself abolitionist, but Congress is desperate for money. and they're like, these cats have showed up with cash in hand and want to buy some land. And they're like, yeah, we can make that happen. So the first one is this little bit right here. The Ohio company purchase was some people from New England. And then you can see they start selling all the rest of it. This part belonged to Virginia. This is where Virginians who were against slavery were told, you want to free your slaves? You cannot do it here in Virginia. But if you move up here, then we'll let you do it up here. And so they established a whole bunch of rules which become very important to us, such as any state who's added will be equal to the original 13. That's a Jefferson thing. Actually, in Tom's defense, and again, I'm being big here because it's not my favorite. Tom in 84 suggested barring slavery in the new lands, and it was voted down. So to his credit, he suggested barring slavery. It's voted down, but in 87, it is passed in the process. But this gives us one more little glance. This is where we'll stop of what we can see is how they're walking this same line of this sort of blending. We're not going to be a nation of any specific religion or any specific God in a sense of like that's linked in. And at the same time, we're going to acknowledge its necessity and its value and giving us this foundation. In the 87 document, they're like, we know that there needs to be education for teaching us morality and knowledge, and that's necessary to good government. So we're going to tell you, build some schools and teach the kids. And they did, all in that area. In that place. But notice also, they did not allow and support Congress in giving any money. And this is the same Congress, by the way. Again, if you think, where's their positions? They do pay for a chaplain. So they do the Articles of Confederation Congress will produce a Bible. I know a Bible's been produced recently. That's a little controversial for people. But the Congress paid for a Bible to be produced at its sort of like for the United States. Why? Because they wanted you to become good Christians? No. Because they wanted you to learn the foundational things that they thought necessary to maintain the civic governance. So what did this do for us? Well, they didn't pick a side. Many scholars, this has been puzzling to them. The normative position in society was that you would do this. And at the same time, they thought we need to find a way to support this virtue position that we think needs both the Enlightenment viewpoints, the laws of nature, as well as this religious of the people of where we live now, people mostly with Christians, nature is God, and we need those kind of blended in the process. And so they could have picked something, they didn't. That's the evidence that you and I can take as we're thinking, how do we navigate in our own day? And I think that's a good place for us to stop. So thank you so much for coming. If you have any questions, thank you. As always, I'd like to take any questions. If anybody has any questions, and if not, that's great also. Yes, sir?
I know that at the beginning of your presentation, if I recall correctly, you said that your feeling was over the past 60 years or so, there's been a greater gulf between factions in the country and so forth. There's no common ground and so forth. And I have a question more than anything else. About the only time I can think of where we achieved something like that was 9/11. But now I'm not a historian.
Right.
You may know of many more examples where the country,
Yeah.
I'm talking about races,
Yep.
religions, et cetera, et cetera.
So the question is, are there other times when there might have been, because it doesn't seem like there are often times when we have been united. So make sure I say one thing clear. It's a great question. One, there's never been a time when there's 100%.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the first marker. I would say in the idea of holding common values. So Lincoln talks about in his second inaugural address, they all pray to the same God. Right. So he would say even in that moment, we had a common set of kind of value propositions. I would argue, and I think he would accept, that there was the pieces that we didn't agree on. The best way to look at it is if you look at that pattern of crisis that I told you about every 80 years, the years coming out of the crisis, there's about a 20-year window coming out of the crisis. That's called the high, or I like think of it like spring. Think of it like seasonal, if you think of the 4 seasons. So winter's like death, right? Because everything dies. It seems like it's doom and gloom, and the flowers all go away, and most places the trees lose their leaves. Spring is the fresh budding. It's the fresh newness of life. So in the high or the spring after the crisis, if you were tracking kind of unity and agreement, it's highest there. and then it usually stays level, and in some cases may rise a little bit in the second 20 years. That's known as the awakening, but that's also the moment when you begin to split. And then the next 20 years fall is called the unraveling. And so from at least 40 years on, you're on a run to the next splitting. And it's probably a natural thing in any group of people. I mean, there's only about 30 of us or 40 of us here in the room. If we all went on a rocket to Mars, we were going to establish a colony, we would set out what the ground rules were. And some of us might go, yeah, I'm not going, because that's going to be the rules. But maybe we could all get to an agreement where 40 or 50 of us are on the same page. Go up there, give us time, we'd find places we differ. And if we allowed other people to come in, then we'd find places where they differ, even if it's just our children being born. Over time, there'd be a natural sense of how people come to different conclusions about things that maybe 30 years before they had another conclusion. So I think there's a natural, so for me, the idea of there being a crisis is not an abnormal thing or a thing to be scared of in its weirdness. It's actually something, so the book I wrote in 2011 was called Tracking the Storm. And the whole point of that was that you could see through the previous events in history where the markers were of what had previously been the telltale signs of the coming of the crisis. And when I wrote it in 2011, we had hit all but like 5. And I said in 2011, we'll know for sure if this is going to go down when we get to 2020. And when 2020 happened, I got a lot of phone calls from people going, oh my gosh. But it's not like I was being prophetic. It was just I could kind of read the signs. But so there's a signal. But that we know the signal, for me, it's then, well, now what? Right? And the now what for me is reminding us of this kind of need for a common virtue foundation. If someone wants to save the system, you're totally allowed as a citizen to disagree with me and go, no, I think a system of a republic and a citizen governance is horrible. And I wish we had X, Y, or Z, and there's lots of options. Someone is allowed to do that. But if a person says, no, I want to preserve government of the people, the founders, and they're linking back to Rome and Athens, would say the only way possible is that common virtue. Good question. Anybody else? You guys are awesome. If you want to reach me, here you can. You can find that information there. And I'd love to see you again. Thanks so much for coming. Have a wonderful rest of your July.